On that bright, peaceful afternoon, the diner's red trim glowed like an old photograph brought to life. Marina Hull stood at the edge of the diner's shadow with a small purse clutched to her chest. Her shoulders rounded the way old bones settle into themselves, reading lips the way some people read music, searching for meaning in the shape of mouths because the world of sound had been taken from her years ago. She came every day not for the food but for the movement of life, the clink of coffee cups, the tumble of children's laughter, the cadence of strangers making small, ordinary choices that reminded her she still belonged to a world in motion. Today, the motion turned on her. A group of teens, loud in the way the young often are, circled with phones lifted like small, accusing mirrors. Their smirks were exaggerated, their gestures cruelly theatrical. They clapped behind her to watch for a flinch. They mimed conversations she could not hear and did not belong to, and in their amusement they treated her like a costume to try on and then discard. In the heavy, shimmering heat of that afternoon, she felt smaller than the shadow of her own hat, and every pair of filming eyes was a needle. If you believe in kindness and second chances, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Loom. The tension built like thunder beneath the surface. Marina's hands trembled as she tried to gather a napkin that had been snatched away, her palms scraping the coarse asphalt when she stumbled, the skin catching grit like a cheap photograph ruined at the edges. The teens laughed, high and sharp, a sound that would have been a wave had she been able to hear it. Now it was only the soft twist of their mouths she could read, the cruel crescendos of their faces. Troy Maddox stood at the center like a young monarch of empty bravado, a phone in one hand, a pretend microphone in the other, playing at an interview while his friends egged him on. He nudged her, not enough to hurt by the measure of the world, but enough to unbalance the frail geometry of her step. Marina fell, the burger she had bought rolling away like a small planet escaping orbit. And in that stupid, ordinary tumble, all the history of being disregarded seemed to gather and press down on her chest. Cars passed. People glanced. No one moved. The day continued to hum around the wound, fear wrapped around Marina like a thin, familiar coat. There was the old, steady ache of being overlooked, the way years had built walls around her and meant she had learned to live in them. She had lived with the silence long enough to read the face of the world, but that insight had never prepared her for being used as entertainment. She tried to push herself up, but her hands were unsteady, and the asphalt bit into the tender skin of her palms. Her eyes, which had once been quick and bright with 1,000 stories, filled not with tears but with something quieter and heavier, a loneliness that tasted like rust and old coffee. The teens laughed and filmed and cheered themselves on, their laugh tracks ready for an audience that would consume the moment before scrolling on. It was small and brutal and utterly modern, the kind of cruelty that wears no uniform, that claims its victims in daylight and posts proof to an indifferent internet. Beneath the surface of that ordinary cruelty, another sound began to form, low at first, like a distant heart. It was not thunder, though the sky held a slow, cloudless peace. It was a rumble of engines, a deep vibrato that moved through the soles of shoes and into the bones, a sound that made the air itself seem to lean in. The teens barely registered it at first. Teens are often drunk on the moment, but the rumble grew, folding into itself until it filled the small world of the parking lot. One motorcycle, then another, lined up like a row of knights in chrome and leather. 9 figures dismounted and moved with a discipline and purpose that belied the myths people told about bikers. They were guardians of Solace, a local group who had long since staked their reputation on protecting those who had been pushed aside. Elderly neighbors, lonely veterans, anyone the world had forgotten to shelter. At their front was Rogan, a man whose presence carried a kind of compact authority. Broad shoulders beneath a vest shaped by wind and wear, a white beard braided with the patience of years, eyes that could be gentle as a lullaby or sharp as a blade when justice demanded it. Around him, the others fanned out like a silent wall, their motions precise, their faces set in an expression that could not be mocked away. When Rogan knelt beside Marina, the movement felt less like a rescue and more like recognition. He did not shout. He did not make a spectacle. He slipped a large hand warm, weathered, careful, behind her back and helped her sit, tilting her as one might hold a thin, fragile vase. The burger was lifted with a reverence that suggested it was more than food. It was a small token, an ordinary restoration. Kira Vale, whose hands were steady and whose eyes were fluent in a vocabulary of gestures, signed to Marina slowly, each motion clear and full of a rare, quiet tenderness. Marina's face changed in those minutes. Confusion folding into relief, relief into a soft, startled gratitude, as if someone had translated a whole small world back to her in a language she understood. The teens lowered their phones. Shame, a heat thinner and sharper than arrogance, bled across their faces and left them smaller than before. They backed away, their laughter swallowed by the thickness of the biker's silence. Rogan's authority was not the clang of a gavel but the simple articulation of consequence. He stood as a sentinel, broad and immovable, and the emptiness of the teens' cruelty felt suddenly exposed under his gaze. He did not humiliate them, he did not call them names. He offered a demonstration of humanity so direct that the spectacle they had sought collapsed of its own weight. The diner staff emerged with coffee and fresh napkins and hands that had been waiting for permission to move. The hum of engines receded and the ordinary noises of the world returned. But the tenor of the afternoon had changed. Where there had been a small, vicious joy, there was now a communal breath, a recalibration of what it meant to be seen. Marina ate slowly, savoring each bite as though it were an act of reclamation. Her hands steadied in small increments, and with every chew the lines around her mouth softened, as if someone had gently smoothed a map that had long ago been creased. Kira sat on the booth beside her, fingers patient and fluent in the small vocabulary of comfort. Rogan lingered like a guardian who refuses to leave until the threat has been fully dissolved. They did not parade their bravery. They simply sat with her and let the simple, human things happen. The passing of a warm plate, the filling of a cup, the exchange of a signed phrase that translated simply, "You are safe." In that quiet, Marina's story shifted from being a tale of violation to a testament of tenderness, and the edges that had been jagged with shame were re-rounded by care. There is a particular kind of silence that follows when a crowd has watched cruelty and then witnessed its undoing. It is not empty, it is full of reconsideration. People who had stood frozen with their phones now lowered them, and in that soft collective retreat there was a lesson learned without sermons. The teens left with their heads down. The performance they had hoped to make evaporated into a small, private embarrassment that would, perhaps, teach them more than a scolding ever could. Rogan and his crew did not seek applause. Their actions were a kind of uncompromising charity that needed no witness. And Marina, who had arrived that afternoon surrounded by the ache of years and the small rituals that kept her going, found herself held in a way that belonged more to family than to strangers. In the days that followed, the memory of that afternoon did not fade into a neat moral headline. It lived in the slow, human work of recovery. Marina began to visit the diner more often with a small, steady company at the table beside her. The staff learned to set a place for her before she asked. Neighbors who had once passed with polite nods began to stop and ask if she needed help carrying groceries. Rogan and Kira returned to their rides, engines a gentle counterpoint to their steady, watchful lives, and the town learned a small but durable lesson about vigilance and tenderness. Marina's smile returned not as a neat cure but as a soft, persistent bloom that signaled something deeper had shifted. Her solitude was interrupted not by spectacle but by the steady, worldly truth that people can change the tone of a day, a life, a small stretch of time, simply by choosing to stand. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and comment, and tell us where you're watching from so we can appreciate you. In the end, the cinematic moment was not the roar of the engines nor the fall on the asphalt but the quiet work that followed. Hands that helped, eyes that looked twice, and a group of 9 people who showed up and turned cruelty into a lesson in dignity. It is a reminder that kindness can arrive like thunder or like a soft hand at your back, but it is always louder than the cruelty that tries to drown it out. On that bright afternoon, when small mercies proved mightier than mockery, the town learned that being seen is sometimes all it takes to begin healing. and that even the smallest acts of care can change everything.